Okay, we're live.
Sure. So thanks, Michael, and thanks all others who joined the call. I guess this is pending for quite some time by now, but the whole idea is to look at how do we come up with set of best practices for production scale applications uh, based on our experience and based on our understanding on the whole platform. Some of the discussions that we can find in the attached issue. So basically, the intent of this meeting is to have some conversations around basic structure of how this best practices documentation should be around, and then look at the coverage, that is, what all different use cases and scenarios need to be covered. And then once we have some convergence on that, uh, look at who all can participate and take up work items. Not necessarily I'm expecting all these three items to be discussed and decided in one go. For that matter, we could run this meeting in iterations, probably 2 or 3 or 4, until we get a concrete understanding about what we should be doing, etc. So for each of these items, the attached issue has some minimal context and some conversations. Probably to kickstart with the first item, that is the structure of the best practices. Uh, the main theme or the main ideations that we discussed is whether we should have, in terms of the symptoms, the most probable symptoms such as a memory leak, exceptions, performance, crash.
Sorry, Jerish,
Yeah,
just you referenced an issue there. I'd like to put it in the minutes. Do you know which issue that was?
I can do that. Yeah, this is issue number 211.
Okay, thanks. Sorry
Yeah,
for interrupting.
no problem. So the questions were whether the structure should be around the symptoms, how they occur in the production scale applications, or versus um, organized based on deployment scenarios, such as cloud deployments versus desktops, or versus some other deployments, and see in each of the deployments how do we perform the diagnostics on the deployed applications. So that's probably one of the key things we need to have some conversation around. So any thoughts on that?
I guess my first thought is structuring it around what problem you're investigating would make sense to me. Like, and then once you have that, you can then see how that works in the different environments. So for example, like if there's a memory leak, how would you debug a memory leak? And then once you have like sort of the baseline one, you could then say, okay, well, how do you apply that in, a Docker image, or how do you apply that in Cloud Foundry, or, the typical deployment environments? I don't know what other people think on that front.
Yeah, I agree. In some cases, we can, for example, show it to, say, an expert which won't work on serverless scenarios, for example, but it can work on a containerized infrastructure. So, starting with the symptom and then narrowing it down to the structure of the application, I think it's a good idea.
Okay, so you would start as well with like the symptom, like, hanging or out of memory or whatever, and then yeah, okay, we can do it in the simple environment, and then, yeah, okay, it's harder in serverless. How do we actually extend it to that environment?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. The pros and cons I see with both the approaches. If you look at the use case based or deployment based scenario, the problem is there could be n number of different deployments. For example, if you take the cloud itself, depending on the vendor, depending on the specific topology or the architecture, you can have so many different variations, and it's not necessarily easy to come up with uh, all the different combinations. Um, on the other side, if you look at the symptom-based approach, like the crash, hang, or performance-based things, that's pretty easy to document and relate. But at the same time, um, the actual production scale applications will still need to do certain amount of logistical aspects to get to that level. For example, if I start documenting things around how do you look at the crash, the baseline we start would be take the crash dump and launch it in a specific debugger. Now, most part of the activity would be around how do you get the crash dump onto the debugging system. So how do we help the user on that front? So that's probably one drawback with the symptom-based approach.
Right. I'm not sure I see that as a drawback, though, because like it's we need to start somewhere, and I think if the symptoms are common, if we have a good understanding of that, that gives you a solid basis to then move into the production deployments, right? Like if it's like, okay, we have these 5, and generically here's a best practice, then you can say, okay, well, we need to build on those for each production deployment. And so, for example, serverless, you could say, well, we have this base one for the example that you had, which was a crash. Can I, can I just apply the best practices already defined generically? Well, wait a sec, no, because there's this extra step. But you could refer back to the base one and say, okay, this is where you start. But before you can get to apply that, you then need to do these things, which were specific to the deployment environment. So not to say we shouldn't do both at the same time. Like you could do a little bit of one and a little bit of others, but it seems to me starting at the symptoms gives you the base on which you can then build all the other combinations that you want to work on.
Yep, I agree to that. Makes sense. Yeah.
And also, maybe I'm just thinking off the top of my head, it makes it easier to break it up, right? Like it's so for example, debugging a crash or a memory leak, we probably, unless there's differences due to your production environment, we probably want to come up with sort of a one or some small number of sort of recommended approaches, as opposed, and that'll be hard to have multiple different people working on them in parallel, right? Because you may come up with conflicting recommendations or whatever. But once you had that, you could then have one person look at cloud, one person look at serverless, one person look at Cloud Foundry to see how it applies in each of those.
Agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
So does that mean that we have a convergence on the structure of the documentation?
Yes, Ruben Mateus, is that like the starting with the symptoms makes sense to you too?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. The symptom-based approach also has the advantage that some of the we could get some of the priorities. For example, in the link document, Julian was mentioning that he has attempted some activity in this regard, and he has done a wonderful job of documenting how do we diagnose the memory leak. It's a pretty old document. Probably the debugger and the V8 object structure itself would have changed fundamentally since then. But the approach and the way we look at the objects in the heap and the layout and things like that do not change. So we could actually latch on to some of the existing arts as well if we go with that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. We should try to not reinvent the wheel if we can borrow the wheel.
Yeah, agree. So since that part is converged, the next one is on the coverage. That is among the various set of problems that the production system can be subjected to. What is the subset we want to focus on, either based on the number of issues which are reported to the issue tracker, or based on the availability of the tools, based on the comprehensiveness or the correctness of the tools which are available at the moment, or based on which we think is most important. So clearly, I'm sorry, clearly memory leak and exceptions are by far the most common problem symptoms. That's my experience. Uh, do anybody have a difference in opinion on that?
Sorry, you said the memory leak and I'm just taking some
Memory leak and exceptions.
exceptions, right? Okay.
Yeah. Hang as such is the least reported issue symptom. Performance come often, and crash, yes. But in terms of the actual help that is required or actual usability of a best practice document will be very limited in terms of exceptions, because exceptions come with a stack trace in most of the cases, and the stack trace itself is self-explanatory.
Right. I
And
guess in some of the production employments like serverless, though, how easy is it to get that stack trace?
yeah, I mean, if the application is terminating with an unhandled exception,
Yep.
the standard error attached with the application is definitely going to capture the exception stack trace. But then the question is how the standard error is being treated in the deployment and where that is being routed to.
Right.
Michael, do you mean because of the asynchronous nature?
More just around that. Like, do you get the artifacts that are generated? So in this case, it's like a standard out something that after your cloud function is run, thrown an exception. Do you have a console you can just go and get that from? If the answer is yes, then maybe that's not a more complicated thing. Other examples like core dumps or whatever. I don't think they currently have a place where you can go find those. So I guess I was just getting at, like, it may be not that much on the base. Here you look at the stack trace, you go do something, but maybe then the second layer is where it gets interesting, is where, like, okay, how do you get your stack traces in each of these different environments?
Yeah, core dumps will be difficult, but I guess like the regular stack traces should be available pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. So what I think is we should definitely have a documentation around memory leak and crash and performance, because these are the things which general audience do not have enough skills or enough understanding about how to diagnose. And based on the actual symptom scenario, the diagnostics and the problem determination can be really tedious. So um, my take is first priority goes to memory leak, performance, and crash.
That sounds reasonable to me.
Okay. Then the key question would be around probably that's a subset of the question or the next level details what I'm asking here, but looking at the issue which you opened in the core about the tier status or the tools or the frameworks, there is n number of tools available at the moment, and each one of it has different status, different capabilities, and different coverage. So which one we actually expose as the best practice? For example, in terms of crash, we may have LLDB as well as the native debuggers and something else. So how do we position the tools within the documentation? Do we have a guidance on that? Some of them are part of the core itself. Some of them are third party. Some of them do not have complete capability, etc. Performance, again, if you look at the performance, you have the inbuilt profiler, you have the tprof that's coming from the operating system, and you could use other third-party tools as well. So you could also use the tracers to see where the time is spent, etc. So
I guess, like, from my perspective, I'd look at it the reverse way, is to say, okay, what's the most effective, easiest path? And that may vary, of course. So you might need, even for memory leak, there might be a couple different flows that you'd follow. But it's like, what do we think is the best way to go? And then we should be working on the level of the support for the tooling to support that, right? So if we say this tool is actually the absolute best way to debug these things, but it's likely to be broken at any time by a node, well, then that's probably something we should work on in terms of adding testing and stuff to improve that. So it's kind of like, don't determine our guidance by the current level of sort necessarily. I guess that should, that could factor in a bit, but try and figure out what's the best way to do these things, and then try and make the tools, look at whether we can, adjust the level of the support for the tools to improve, so that I guess what I'm saying in a long way is we should focus on trying to have the best level of support for the tools that we are saying are important to do this kind of debug and problem determination.
yeah, but probably you're right. But my point is, if you look at crash, for example, we should be talking about the most common scenario, not necessarily a corner case. So if we are talking about the most common scenario, it could be a crash in the C++ code or the JS code. And for both these scenarios, there could be more than one tool which will work, but with different capabilities and different user experience. So in such scenarios, do we document using one tool, but also mention the capability of the other tool side by side, or do we provide two different scenarios covering both the tools, or we just let's see which is the best one for this particular scenario which we are trying to demonstrate, and stick to that.
I think we should, in the first scenario, for example, we document both tools. For example, node report and LL node, and come up with pros and cons of each tool, explaining which scenarios they should be used. Because, for example, node report gives a fast and simple output, whereas LL node is harder to use, so it usually requires a more defensive user. So maybe we could have uh, experience levels for each tools or something similar.
Yeah, I would think that like that's kind of fits my thinking where it's like you could kind of say, here's your first attempt using the simplest approach that'll be the fastest. It uses the simple tools like Node Report is exactly what I've had in mind for something like that. It's like, if you can do this, you can see that, great, you're done. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, then here's the next level of investigation, and that uses this LLDB or LL node, which is more sophisticated, takes more work, but will let you dive into more detail. So I agree that there should be, we probably need to mention a couple tools, and it may even be like a layered approach of like, hey, start with this, then go to this more complicated thing. If that still doesn't work, here's an even more work, but maybe get you where you want to get to.
Yeah. I guess that's pretty much I had on the discussion points in terms of the coverage and the positioning of the tools. The other thought which came to my mind is while we actually develop these artifacts using specific tools, it's also possible that we come across um, you know existing capabilities as well as some of the shortcomings of these tools, probably not revealed until so far. That's also possible. Unless if there is no other comments on this side, then the only thing that is left with is on how do we kickstart the work, who takes what, and things like that. I see in the connected issue, Matthias has expressed interest on performance symptom best practices, and I myself has um, promised to pick up the crash. Does that stay intact? I'm just checking with Matthias because it has been some time by now.
I think my one first action is we need like a table of contents.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Like it'd be good to have a table of contents and maybe even just including the things we think. Now, maybe we can start it with just the ones you've listed as a priority or include them all. But at that point, we could then say, okay, who wants to do a first pass of, a description of what the content might be or something like that. And you can assign, I'd put the people's names who have volunteered, but that makes it easy for other people to volunteer on particular sections as well.
Okay. So the table of contents would feature the type of the material or the artifact and the perceived priority of that, and then a third column where people can come and fill in based on their interest.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Okay.
I'm going to have to drop off, so I'm going to give you the ownership, and
okay,
I'll,
sure.
I'll catch up with you afterwards to see what we need to get started on.
Sure. Just wanted to ask you, what is the formality for closing? Is there any YouTube link or any recording that I need to stop or something like
If
that?
you just stop the meeting itself, that will all stop.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, you're now the host, and so I'll talk to you later.
Thanks,
Bye.
Michael.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
So that settles on how do we take it forward based on the table of contents, the content type, and the priority, as well as any specific tools which we want to recommend or endorse to be used for this particular content type, and then leave the next column blank so that people can come and pick them up based on their interest. Yeah. Then the other thing which was discussed also in the connected link was about linking the document directly in the format of the node.js.org website, so that you don't need to reformat the content for publications. I'm not sure I completely follow the proceedings on that, but does anybody have an idea about that? My whole my whole thinking was on the lines of we just create the content and open as PRs to this repository, that is node.js/diagnostics, get it reviewed by the peers and land it in the diagnostics project area itself, and float it around for consumption. But then I realized that it's much more consumed if it is in the website format, the HTML format. I don't have much idea about how do we do that conversion. Is it need to be performed right in the development phase, or it can be formatted at a later point in time?
Which formatting?
So on the website redesign repository, they are using a markdown, a customized markdown for the content. We can try to follow that, I think. If we still render correctly on GitHub, and we are already ready for the new website. That's a possibility.
Okay. So specifically, I'm referring to, I'm putting this link in the chat. So in the chat window, I have put a link that is the command. The command before that, the command itself, and the command after that talks briefly about how do we integrate this with the website. Honestly, I don't follow that command as it is. So what you're saying is, Ruben, that we could actually use the markdown that is followed in the website design document for the content document itself, or we can use the regular format that is used in any documentation in the core. or always?
So every blog post, for example, at a moment is written in Markdown. And when we have a new release, it's just a brief, sorry? Matthias? No. And it is then just formatted in HTML. And it should be pretty straightforward to write to Markdown, as we do that all the time. And as far as I know, it's just perfectly transformed immediately.
Okay. That makes sense, because that's the way we do it in the core documentation also, right? And it gets translated into the HTML.
Yeah.
So
I don't worry about that. Let's just write it down in Markdown as we do regularly. And then we can open a PR against the website, and it will just then transfer. There's some metadata as far as I know. I have to check that again, but that's pretty simple.
okay, yeah. That means that's also settled. So the bottom line is that we just follow our documentation format, and that is the markdown, regular markdown, and come up with PRs that covers each of these symptoms, and take it from there on.
I have an example for how it looks like. I'll just send it in the chat as well. So it's regular Markdown, besides just having a tiny bit of metadata at the top, like date, version, category, etc.
Okay. Okay, got it. Thanks. Yeah. So that's pretty much I wanted to cover in this meeting. Is there any other things which you think is relevant to be discussed in combination with this?
I think we have a good starting point, so.
Okay. So the next action, which I believe we should be doing, is mostly coming up with the table of contents and freeze on that. Also wait for people to come in and start, registering their interest. Once we have a handful of a list items over there, probably we set up another instance of this meeting and review the content, and then probably make a prioritization on top of that. For example, if the list is produced in some random order, we reorder it in terms of which one should be featuring first and things like that. And then if more people are participating, we could also gather the insights or opinions from them, and then take it from there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So that's pretty much we have today. So unless any other points to discuss or any other clarifications, we can stop the meeting, I guess. Okay. Thanks, Ruben, and thanks, Matthias, for joining.
Welcome. Have a nice day. Bye.
Sure. Thanks.